Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. How an Edna Korth chose a lifestyles. Most human beings would not live on a life in Alaska's brutal, unforgiving wilderness. For over 40 years, they have got relied on their abilities, instincts, and each different toe life to tell the tale some of the harshest situations on Earth. But their journey hasn't been just about resilience. It has also been marked by way of deep heartbreak in the back of the lovely landscapes and self-sufficient way of life lies a story of unattainable loss. What tragedy nearly broke them, and why, after everything, do they nevertheless refuse to depart the land that has given them so much, yet taken even extra toll? In reality, understand what we are about to uncover. We need to return to wherein it all began. How an Edna are a rare breed proper off the grid, survivalist living. Deep in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, it is one of the most distant places on Earth, and hardly ever anyone lives there. In fact, the cause area among the final to do it, the antique where lying, absolutely on the land to live on. But Heimo Korth wasn't born into this life. He got here from Appleton, Wisconsin, a city that, whilst not huge, become nonetheless way larger than Fairbanks and Juneau blended. At the time, his parents, Eric and Irene, weren't outdoorsy. Despite the fact that his dad had grown up on a farm, he by no means learned to hunt lure or fish as an alternative. He labored in a manufacturing unit, supplying a consistent, predictable lifestyles. Heimo attempted that existence, too, working in a manufacturing facility lower back in Wisconsin. But it wasn't for him. He had always felt interested in the wild, even as a kid growing up inside the suburbs. Whilst other youngsters ran in the direction of town, he did the contrary, just a brief stroll away. There were open fields and woods waiting to be explored. Most of the time he went on my own. Now, not due to the fact he needed to, but due to the fact no person else seemed to proportion his love for it. By the time he became a teen that pulled toward, the wilderness turned into too robust to forget about in 1973. At just 18 years vintage, he activate for Canada's Northwest Territories, chasing his dream, but this become for the duration of the Vietnam struggle, and an 18-year vintage heading north raised eyebrows. Many assumed he turned into dodging the draft, and those weren't exactly welcoming. Still, he decided to carve out a place for himself within the wild. His first job turned into as an assistant to a hunting manual. However, the pay becomes so horrific, he ought to slightly come up with the money for hire and food. Finally, he had no choice but to go back to Wisconsin. But the wilderness in no way stopped calling him. Then he were given a rec and possibility in Alaska, operating for a guide who hunted huge recreation inside the Brooks Range. He became 20 years old when he stepped into the wilderness for true, and he never came back after running with a searching guide for a while. He were given hooked up with a friend who ran a trapping line in Alaska. This buddy didn't just give him recommendation. He surpassed over components, meal straps, the entire setup, and flew him out to a faraway cabin inside the center of nowhere. It become just Heimo and the wild for 3 lengthy months. He struggled to educate himself. The way to lure he got here close to ravenous. And if that wasn't bad enough, he fell through the ice on the river, dropping almost the whole thing he had, and not using an actual manner out. He wrote a letter to his vintage boss soliciting for help. To his marvel, his boss sent him a take-a-look at for $500 that changed into simply sufficient to get back to Metropolis and regroup. However, something had shifted. The wilderness had a maintain on him now. He knew this changed into the kind of lifestyles he desired. He spent the rest of that first Asenis on St. Lawrence Island, a tiny Eskimo village, way out inside the Bering Sea, just 90 m from Siberia. That's where he met Edna, though they did not start dating proper away. Now Edna changed into born on January 25th, 1954, as a part of the Yupik human beings. Her native call is May Doan. Growing up in the community meant knowing how to fish, hunt, and live to tell the tale off the land. Her uncle, Jackson Muck, changed into a master at trapping foxes. He taught her the whole lot away, to reduce the furs without adverse them, and how to attend to them after skinning. By then, Heimo had grown to be like own family. He become close with Edna's father, Emerson, and spent lots of time with them. Jackson even took him below his wing, displaying him the fine details of trapping and for guidance, and it did not take long for Jackson to be aware that Heimo had a component for Edna specifically, while Jackson jokingly called Edna Howe's wife. But Howe wasn't looking to admit something. Small towns have a way of making everything all of us is enterprise, and he wasn't approximately to be at the middle of the gossip. Heimo kept himself busy helping CS run the village store and studying tow hunt from the nice in town. While spring rolled round, he left for Beaver Creek Arriva within the White Mountains. Near Fairbanks, a friend had a cabin available and needed someone to look after their puppies for the summer. So Heimo packed up and headed again into the wild for the next 2 winters. Howe changed into deep inside the Brooks Variety, a brutal stretch of mountains wherein survival becomes something however clean. In Alaska they name it hungry country for a purpose. There simply are not many animals out there. Trapping turned into tough meals, turned into scarce, and the bloodless became relentless. With deep snow and freezing temperatures, each single day was a war. He may not have made a fortune, but those winters fashioned him into a real mountainman. He proved simply that he couldn't handiest continue to exist, however thrive in one of the cruelest environments on Earth. After searching a ways, and huge Heimo subsequently determined what he changed into looking for a place alongside the Colleen River. This Rivera, smaller offshoot of the Porcupine River, changed into tucked away deep in Alaska's wilderness. He wished a gap wherein he may want to entice sufficient fur to make a living. However, by the time he arrived, most of the exceptional trapping grounds around the Yukon Flats had been already claimed by using other trappers. However, his pal Bob had already been trapping there and invited Heimo to join him further upriver, so Heimo trekked about 50 mi upstream. Now not realizing, he changed into getting into the very region that would become his domestic for life. 3 years later, he made his way again to Songa XC, excited to peer Edna once more. But the moment he laid eyes on her, it hit him just how lonely he'd been without her. All that point for his or her first date. They kept it simple, but unforgettable. They went fishing for Dolly Varden, took a motorbike ride and topped it off with pizza by means of the overdue 1970s. Edna made the experience to Howe's cabin in the mountains. It turned into her first time seeing the location he had built, and she or he wasted no time pushing him to improve it. She advised him he needed to begin building a real home for her, even though she wasn't certain if it became the right flow. But once she said it, she caught to it, so Heimo set to work. He had no choice, however, to finish earlier than wintry weather, so for a solid week he worked like a man possessed. Just as the first snowflake began falling, he placed the remaining piece in location. Howe and Edna got married in 1982, and for maximum of the 12 months, they had no going for walks, water, no power, and no connection to the outdoor international. Each fall they hunted and trapped, stocking up enough to live to tell the tale. The long brutal winters. Now Edna's existence had already visible its share of heartbreak. Earlier than she met Heimo, she had been engaged to a Swedish biologist, and together they had 2 children, Melinda and Merlin. But tragedy struck whilst her fiancé died in a plane crash, leaving her on my own to elevate their youngsters. It was a devastating loss, and the load of unmarried motherhood rested closely on her shoulders. Her subsequent courting did not convey a whole lot consolation. Either her uncle saw firsthand that the man she dated after wasn't properly for her, unfaithful and unreliable, so whilst Howe came into the image, her uncle became careful. He wanted to make certain this man turned into distinct, that he could deal with Edna right. In time, Howe proved himself. He followed Melinda, although she best lived with them for part of the year. Maximum of the time, she stayed with Edna's mother and father in Savona, where she felt maximum at home. Merlin, Edna's son, lived along with her parents full-time. In Sauna, it became not unusual for children to be raised by using grandparents or other loved ones. However, that did not make it any less complicated for Edna. Leaving them at the back of, even for a few months, changed into painful. However, deep down she understood that her dad and mum could deliver her kids the stableness she couldn't assure in the desolate tract. 4 months after their wedding ceremony, Edna and Heimo welcomed their first daughter together, and that they named her Colin, after the Colin River. Colleen became like a little wildflower, complete of lifestyles and interests. He spent summers choosing blueberries, splashing inside the river, with Edna and Ridding on Hao's shoulders, but greater than some things she cherished to explore. She had a habit of wandering off, so Edna sewed a little bell onto her coat to preserve tune of her each night, because the circle of relatives took their walks along the river. The sound of that tiny bell jingled with each step. She had a fascination with the moon too. Whenever it regarded within the sky, Hao would raise her up so she could see it higher, and she'd point with excitement, calling out moo moo. Then the not possible occurred simply 5 days after. Her third birthday, Colin drowned in a river accident, and that they by no means determined her frame the grief, changed into crushing buddies, and family entreated the courts to depart the bush to begin over someplace else. However, they couldn't. This turned into Colleen's home. Her laughter nevertheless echoed in the wind. Her little footprints have been. Nonetheless, in the dust, leaving would feel like leaving behind. Her memory that day after they returned to their cabin. Hao carved a timber cross for her. He carefully etched her call and the dates of her short lifestyles into it. That fall, he and Edna carried the pass up a small mountain overlooking the valley, and the river. They placed it there, a marker of their love and loss, determined to honor their daughter. They tried to get the mountain named after her. They petitioned the Board of Geographic Names, but the response was cold. Colin wasn't considered historically sizable enough in spite of aid from the governor and a congressman. They had been time and again denied. They collected signatures, did the whole lot asked of them, but the solution remained the same after at the same time as they needed to let it pass. However, even in their sorrow, Hao and Edna refused to allow pass of the existence that they had constructed. They had been dedicated to the wilderness, to the land. They'd selected Heimo, once positioned it in attitude. If a couple in Dallas misplaced a toddler in a vehicle accident, could they flow away, simply to break out the ache, no due to the fact it changed into their domestic? And that's how he and Edna felt even many years later. They nevertheless were given teary-eyed. Considering Colleen, the grief never sincerely left. However, they carried on. In time, they'd two greater daughters, Rhonda and Kren. They also created a circle of relative subculture. Every soften, they might make the adventure up to the mountain, to the place wherein they'd planted. Colin's move years exceeded, but the wilderness remained domestic. Hao took pleasure inside the life they'd constructed, in preserving alive a way of residing that had existed for hundreds of years. What began as an adventure have become virtually the way they lived then. In 1992, Himiko's existence inside the wild stuck the public's interest. Whilst he seemed in braving Alaska, a National Geographic special at the start, he wasn't positive, approximately, or worried the display would possibly make his lifestyles in the mountains look awful. But, in the long run, he took a threat, and to his comfort, he was satisfied with the way it became out. The documentary observed 4 households living deep within the Alaskan wilderness, and it was a rare threat to look a young Heimo, Edna and their kids lower, back while they had been just children. Any other family featured become the Hayden who lived at the Coos River, certainly one of them. Susan Hayden turned into only a youngster at the time, already walking her canine team and trapping years later. She and her brother revisited their old home, and Susan even made some appearances at the closing Alaskans fast ahead to 2003, and Hao's cousin James Campbell, a creator, sent him a letter with an concept he desired to write a book about Hao's lifestyles. At the start, Heimo wasn't interested. However, after some notion, he decided to give Campbell a threat. James made the lengthy journey from Wisconsin to Alaska, spending an entire season with the core circle of relatives he lived the way they did, experiencing firsthand the brutal cold, the isolation, and the day-by-day struggles of surviving in one of the most harsh locations on Earth. That experience turned into the 2004 ebook, The Final Frontiersman, which told the story of Hao and his circle of relatives' existence. Inside the Wild, the ebook was a hit, nicely written, gripping, and full of uncooked real-life adventure. In 2009, Vice Media got Here knocking they filmed How's Arctic Refuge, additionally known as Surviving by Myself in Alaska, a documentary that gave an unfiltered study How and Edna's lifestyles inside the barren region. It's the kind of movie that attracts you in now, not just because of the beautiful, unforgiving landscape, however, because of the humans living in it. Then came 2012, when How all of a sudden ended upon flying wild Alaska. All he desired changed into a flight to Fairbanks. So he reached out to the show, big name, who came about to be Apolot, subsequent Element. He knew he was on TV once more. However, it wasn't till 2015 that Heimo and his own family genuinely have become household names. It really is when the closing Alaskans premiered. On Animal Planet, the display accompanied a handful of families residing in one of the maximum foreign places in America, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It documented their struggles, their joy, and the way they carved out an existence where most human beings would not. Closing a week, the display ran for 4 seasons with a general of 36 episodes, and by the time it wrapped up in January 2019, it had constructed a loyal fan base. Viewers were interested by way of the one-of-a-kind families. But there has been no doubt How and Edna Korth have been the coronary heart of it all. They were not simply surviving in the wild, they had been thriving. How's passion for the Alaskan way of lifestyles was infectious. Inside the first actual episode, he placed it into phrases that is an adventure, that is joy, you're sure to nature, nature directs your path, and that became the truth for them. How reportedly earned around $3.00 enduro in step with episode of The Ultimate Alaskans. However, money turned into in no way the driving pressure. This turned into the life he and Edna had selected, for higher or worse. And the show did not simply capture the good instances, it confirmed the heartbreak too. Like once they misplaced their 2-wire vintage daughter Colleen in a canoeing coincidence, maximum reality indicates gloss over the difficult stuff. But the last Alaskans by no means shied far from the truth, notwithstanding its achievement. The show turned into highly priced to produce. And that's a part of why it only lasted 4 seasons. However, what made the remaining Alaskan stand out become its authenticity. Not like other Alaska-based totally fact suggests that leaned into drama or exaggerated chance, this one stayed authentic to actual existence. There have been no staged arguments, nobody seeking to get well known, just people dwelling the manner they usually had. A few had been born into it, wearing on generations' antique traditions. Others had moved to Alaska looking for solitude and reason. In 2016, James Campbell revisited How's story and braving it, this time bringing his daughter alongside Torrival in existence at How's cabin. It became a charming examine how matters had modified, or perhaps how they hadn't. Years later, How and Edna's 3 daughters, Millie, Rhonda and Kren, had all grown up and settled into their very own lives in Fairbanks, some distance from the remote wilderness where they were raised. But it's clear that the wild still calls to them. Kren, the youngest, feels that pull the most. Now she and her husband are making plans to circulate toward her mother and father, bringing their son Colby alongside for the adventure. Regardless of the space, the own family remains related. The youngsters and grandkids still go to How and Edna at their far-flung cabin, and each summer, How and Edna make their way again to Fairbanks to spend time with them. However, as soon as fall rolls around, they return to the best existence they have got ever truly regarded available in the wild. How still makes a residing the old college manor, strolling in tice lines that reach for hundreds of miles through the snow-blanketed wilderness. He rides a snowmobile throughout those good-sized frozen landscapes, monitoring and trapping wolves. Wolverines, foxes, martins, and beavers. The beaver meat makes for a good meal, and their furies treasured amongst trappers. Heimo has a recognition as one of the great wolverine trappers in North America. Edna traps too, but she sticks towards domestic, focusing at the essentials. She still SWS their wintry weather tools via handcrafting How's heavy-duty parka and the thick gloves that protect him from the brutal cold. The years are including up and being to this point from their family is not easy, however, irrespective of what How and Edna usually go back to the cabin While iciness comes, that land, that existence, it's in their blood, how still strong and full of power. Say she hopes to spend the relaxation of his days out there inside. The handiest vicinity this has ever felt like home,